The dog hit the fence so hard the chain link screamed. 95 pounds of Belgian Malinois, scar tissue across his muzzle, teeth bared, eyes locked on the woman standing 20 feet away with her hands in her jacket pockets. 12 special operations soldiers scrambled backward. A sergeant knocked over a water barrel getting clear of the enclosure gate. The woman didn't move. Not a flinch. Not a step back. She just stood there, head slightly tilted, watching the dog the way a person watches something they recognize from a long time ago. "Lady," the handler's voice cracked. "I said get back." She ignored him. The dog hit the fence a second time. And then, silence. Like something in the air changed. The animal dropped to a crouch, nostrils working, and made a sound that wasn't a growl. Nobody in that yard understood what they were watching. Nobody except her. If you love stories about quiet strength and justice finally being served, follow my channel all the way to the end of this story. Hit like, and comment the name of the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has traveled across this world. The order to evaluate the dog had come down on a Tuesday, which was also the day Ava Mitchell's lease expired on her apartment in Kellerton, which was also the day she found out her position at Hargrove Regional Medical Center had been quietly eliminated while she was on a leave of absence she hadn't asked for. 3 things at once, the way bad news usually arrives. Not in sequence, not with any mercy, just all of it landing on the same morning before she'd finished her first cup of coffee. She stood in her kitchen with the termination letter in one hand and her phone in the other, the call from Dr. Whitman still warm in her ear. Budget restructuring. Departmental consolidation. Your dedication has been valued. The language of bureaucratic amputation, delivered by a man who'd never once watched her work. She set the letter on the counter, looked at it for about 4 seconds. Then she picked up the other call, the one from a number she didn't recognize, a 703 area code, which meant Virginia, which meant military, which meant something she'd been half expecting for years without ever quite admitting it to herself. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, belonging to someone named Captain Delaney, who said she'd been referred by a program she'd participated in, a canine rehabilitation evaluation, and that her name had come up in connection with an animal currently housed at Iron Creek Special Operations Base outside Redstone Harbor. A Belgian Malinois, 7 years old, former combat dog, multiple overseas deployments, currently under an active euthanasia order pending behavioral assessment. They needed a certified evaluator with a specific background. Her name had appeared on a very short list. "How short?" she asked. "You're the only name on it," Delaney said. She looked at the termination letter again. Outside, Kellerton was gray and wet, the kind of October morning that felt like a forecast for the rest of the season. "When do you need me there?" "Tomorrow? 800. She exhaled slowly. "I'll be there." Iron Creek sat 40 minutes north of Redstone Harbor on a stretch of land that the highway just seemed to forget about. No signs, no visible turnoff until you were almost past it. A narrow access road cutting through a tree line that suddenly opened up into a facility that was considerably larger than she'd expected. Guard post, security protocols, a gate that required 3 separate confirmations before it opened. A young specialist named Okafor met her at the Visitor Processing Center and drove her through the base in a utility vehicle without saying much. She didn't mind. She was watching the layout. Old habit. She noted the K9 facility on the east perimeter, the training compound behind it, the elevated observation deck that looked down over a wide open yard where a small group of soldiers were running something that wasn't quite a drill. She was assigned a temporary badge and a time. 0900, main K9 facility, evaluation yard, and pointed toward a small waiting room that smelled like industrial cleaner and burnt coffee. She was the only civilian in the building. The operators who passed through the hallway didn't exactly stare, but they didn't not stare either. A couple of them slowed down. One of them, big guy, mid-30s, sergeant stripes, name tape that read Pierce, stopped in the doorway and looked at her the way a person looks at something that doesn't belong where it's sitting. "You the evaluator?" he asked. "Ava Mitchell." She didn't offer a hand. "You?" "Chief Handler Logan Pierce." He crossed his arms. "How much do you know about Malinois?" "Enough." He made a small sound, not quite a laugh. "Lady, that dog has put 2 handlers in the infirmary in the last 3 months. He failed every remediation protocol we threw at him. The unit behaviorist graded him non-recoverable. You have 1 hour to change that assessment, or at 600 tomorrow he gets put down. He paused. So I'll ask again. How much do you know about Malinois? She looked at him steadily. What's his name? Pierce blinked. Excuse me? The dog. What's his name? Rex. Something crossed her face, just briefly, just a flicker. And then it was gone. Thank you, Sergeant. Pierce stared at her for another second, then left. She heard him say something to someone in the hallway. She didn't catch the words, but she caught the tone. Dismissive. The kind of tone that means this is going to be a waste of everyone's time. She'd been hearing that tone her entire adult life. What? The evaluation yard was a concrete rectangle enclosed by chain-link fencing with a secondary containment gate at one end. A semicircle of personnel had gathered around the perimeter. Handlers, junior operators, 2 people with clipboards who might have been admin staff, and a man in a colonel's uniform who stood slightly apart from the rest of them, with his hands clasped behind his back, and his expression suggesting he had already decided how this was going to go. That was Colonel Ethan Voss. She'd learn his name shortly. But she could read the rank from across the yard, and she could read the posture from even farther. She'd worked around men like that before. Men who decided the outcome of things before the evidence was in. Pierce appeared beside her at the secondary gate. Around them, the assembled soldiers were not being subtle. She heard contractor and nurse and something else she chose not to process. Someone near the fence was running a quiet over-under on how long before she asked to leave. Standard procedure, Pierce said, his voice carrying a quality she recognized as performance. He wanted the audience to hear him being professional. We'll bring Rex into the yard from the north gate. You'll conduct your evaluation from this position, behind the secondary line. You do not cross the line without handler accompaniment. You do not attempt direct contact on first exposure. Are we clear? Where's he been housed? Pierce paused. Isolation unit, East Block. How long? 41 days. She absorbed that. 41 days in isolation for a dog wired for work, wired for constant human contact and engagement. She thought about what that did to an animal, what it did to the part of a working dog that needed a purpose to stay sane. She thought about the 2 handlers in the infirmary and reconsidered who exactly had been failed in this situation. Bring him out, she said. Pierce keyed his radio. A door opened at the far north end of the yard. What came through that door was 95 pounds of muscle and controlled aggression moving at a speed that made the distance feel shorter than it was. Rex hit the end of his lead, a 20-foot line held by 2 handlers who both leaned back hard. And the sound he made wasn't a bark. It was something lower and more serious than a bark. The handlers brought him to the yard and unclipped the lead simultaneously, stepping back fast. The dog immediately quartered the space, head low, taking everything in. Then he found her. He crossed half the yard in maybe 2 seconds, and she heard people moving behind her. Scraping boots, a command being shouted, the hollow aluminum clang of someone hitting the fence gate. Pierce grabbed her arm. She stepped forward out of his grip and moved to the line. Mitchell. Pierce's voice was sharp. You do not cross the line. She crossed the line. But later, the people who were there would describe it differently, depending on who was asking and what they thought they'd seen. Some would say she called out to the dog. Some would say she didn't make any sound at all. Some would say the dog stopped at 10 feet, and others would say 5. What actually happened was this. She stepped across the secondary line into the open evaluation space, and she stopped. Rex was still moving toward her, full velocity, nothing uncertain in his body language. And then she said something. One word, low, not shouted, the kind of command that lives in muscle memory rather than conscious decision. Fuss. Heel. The dog hit a full stop like the word was a physical wall. His rear end dropped. He sat. And in the strange, complete silence that followed, with a dozen soldiers standing absolutely still around the perimeter, Rex put his nose forward and took 3 careful sniffs of the air between them. Then he made a sound. Not a growl. Not anything aggressive. A small, questioning vocalization that sounded, to anyone who knew working dogs well, like recognition. Ava crouched down slowly. She held her hand low and open. The dog came to her in 3 steps and pressed his skull against her palm. Behind her, no one moved. She felt Pierce approach, slowly now, not urgent, and stop a few feet back. What did you just say to him? His voice was different. The performance was gone. An old command. She kept her eyes on the dog. He knew it once. Where did you learn it? She didn't answer that. She was running her hands down Rex's shoulders, checking muscle tone, reading the tension in his frame, the way he oriented his ears. He was stressed. The isolation had done damage. She could feel it in him. But beneath the stress, there was a structure, a trained foundation that had never gone away. Somebody had built this dog right. Somebody had put real time and real care into him a long time ago. She knew who. She stayed down there for nearly 4 minutes, just with Rex, letting him recalibrate. He never broke position. He never showed teeth. He sat against her left knee the way working dogs sit when they're in a state the trainers call settled focus. Not relaxed, not switched off, but contained, purposeful. When she stood up, she turned to face the yard. Pierce was staring at her. The colonel, Voss, had moved closer, arms still behind his back, expression no longer certain. He's not non-recoverable, she said. He's been mishandled. Pierce's jaw tightened. Excuse me? 41 days in isolation, no task engagement, no handler continuity. For a dog with his deployment history, that's not remediation. That's sensory deprivation. He didn't fail your protocols failed him. The silence in the yard had a different quality now. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of people recalculating. Voss spoke for the first time. His voice was measured, the careful diction of someone who'd spent decades controlling rooms. Ms. Mitchell, I appreciate the assessment, but you've been in this yard for 6 minutes. Our behavioral specialist conducted 40 days of observation and evaluation. Your specialist used standard civilian pet training frameworks on a combat-trained animal. She said it without heat, which somehow made it worse. Rex isn't responding to aggression triggers. He's responding to inconsistency. Every handler he's been assigned to over the last 3 months has used different command structures. He's not dangerous, he's confused. Voss studied her. And your recommendation? Restructure his handler program. Reestablish a single point of command consistency. Give him task work within 48 hours. She paused. And cancel the euthanasia order. Something moved through Voss's expression. Not agreement, not anger exactly. Closer to recalibration. He was a man who didn't like being told what he'd done wrong. She could see that. But he was also a man who understood when a room had shifted and this room had shifted. That'll require review, he said. Of course. Sergeant Pierce will coordinate access for a secondary evaluation. We'll schedule it for the week. The order's active for tomorrow at 0600, she said. So we'll need to move faster than that. Voss held her gaze for a moment. Then, without expression, Pierce, arrange it. Pierce said, Yes, sir. But he wasn't looking at the colonel. He was looking at her. His arms were still crossed, but something in his face had changed. Not softened, exactly. More like he'd started trying to solve an equation he didn't have all the variables for. They gave her a workspace in the K9 facility, a small room with a metal desk and a window that looked out over the dog runs. And she spent the rest of the afternoon there, going through Rex's file. The file was thick. 7 years of deployment records, handler assignments, commendations, incident reports. She read through it carefully, making notes in the margins of her evaluation forms. The early deployment records were what she'd expected. Exceptional performance, high handler ratings, consistent marks across every behavioral assessment. Then, about 18 months ago, a handler transfer. Then another one, 4 months after that. Then the first incident report, a bite during what was logged as an unpredicted aggression episode. Then another transfer. Then more incidents. She could see the pattern clearly. Every new handler, new commands, new expectations, no continuity. A dog that had been built on precision and trust, gradually unraveling under the weight of inconsistency. She flipped back to the first deployment record. Kandahar Province. A classified program designation that she recognized, not because she'd read about it, but because she'd been part of it. She sat with that for a moment. Rex had been working dogs when she was there. She'd been there for 8 months as part of a joint medical and K9 support unit, and she'd worked alongside the animals that program produced. She hadn't known them all by name. She'd been focused on the handlers, on the human casualty management side. But she'd been in those kennels. She'd run those exercises. It was possible. More than possible that she and Rex had shared the same ground in Kandahar without her ever knowing his designation. She set down the file and looked out through the window at the runs. Rex was in the run at the far end, lying against the fence, his nose tracking every movement in the yard with the systematic attention of an animal whose job was still running even when there was no job to run. She needed to call her contact, not Delaney, someone else, someone further back in the chain, someone who understood what this dog's history actually meant. But before she could do that, the door opened and Pierce came in without knocking. She looked up. He sat down across from her without being invited, which told her something. He put his forearms on the table and looked at her evaluation form and then at her. "Where did you serve?" he asked. "I'm here as an evaluator, Sergeant." "I know what you're here as. I'm asking where you served." She considered him. Logan Pierce was around 38, she guessed. Combat deployments visible in the way he carried his body. Not showy, not stiff, just permanently calibrated. The way a person gets when they've spent enough time in environments where being wrong has real consequences. There were things about him that reminded her of handlers she'd worked with before, the particular quality of attention. "Why?" she asked. "Because no civilian evaluator walks into a live enclosure with a non-recoverable Malinois and stops him with a German command he hasn't heard in 3 years. He held her gaze. "And because that command, fuss, isn't in any standard American working dog protocol. It's in the European import programs. It's in the classified K9 units." She set down her pen. "You know the European programs?" "I ran handlers for 2 years under a joint NATO support structure." "Yeah, I know the European programs." The room was quiet for a moment. "My service record is sealed," she said. "I figured." "Then why are you asking?" Pierce leaned back. "Because Voss is going to push back on the euthanasia stay. He's already called the behavioral specialist to challenge your assessment. And if I'm going to fight for this dog, I need to know who I'm fighting alongside." He paused. "So?" She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, a handler was moving dogs through the exercise yard, commands coming clear through the glass, precise and unhurried. 8 months, she said. Kandahar, joint medical and K9 support, 2018 to 2019. Pierce went still. "The program designation in Rex's early record," she said. "I was part of it. Different role, different unit. But I was there." That program was classified above base level clearance. "Yes. Which means Voss has no idea what he's actually dealing with." "No," she said. "He doesn't." Pierce stared at her for another moment. Then he unfolded himself from the chair and stood up. He wasn't the same person who'd stood in the doorway that morning with his arms crossed, performing professionalism for an audience. "I'll push back the 0600 order," he said. 48 hours. I can buy you that much." "I need 72. 56. That's the most I can do without Voss signing off." She nodded. 56. He started for the door. At the threshold, he stopped without turning around. "For what it's worth," he said, "what you did in that yard this morning, that was—" He stopped, tried again. "Most of these guys have been in combat, and I don't think any of us have seen something like that." She didn't say anything. Pierce left. She turned back to Rex's file and found the page she'd been looking for. The original deployment authorization, the handling notes from Kandahar, the records from the program that had built him. She read through them slowly. At the bottom of the 3rd page, in the handler notes column, there was a reference to a medical support personnel who had assisted with Rex's initial acclimation phase during a particularly difficult behavioral adjustment period early in his training. The notation read, "Exceptional rapport with animal. Recommend for program continuity if available." Her name was in the file. It had been there the whole time. She set the page down, looked at it. Outside, the October light was dropping fast, the training yard going gray in the early dusk, and somewhere on the east side of the facility, in the isolation run, a 7-year-old Belgian Malinois who had spent 41 days waiting for something familiar was doing exactly what she'd seen in his eyes when he pressed his skull against her palm. Waiting. She picked up her phone and dialed the Virginia number. Delaney answered on the 2nd ring. "I'm at Iron Creek," Ava said. "I need you to pull my full service record and have it available for command review." A pause. That record is sealed. I know. Unseal it. Another pause. What's happening up there? She looked at Rex's file. At her own name in the handler notes, in handwriting that wasn't hers, recorded by someone who'd watched her work 7 years ago and thought it mattered enough to write down. The dog knows me, she said, and someone needs to explain to the base commander exactly why. Mum, the line hummed. And Delaney, she said, do it fast. I have 56 hours. Delaney didn't say anything for a long moment. The line carried the particular quality of silence that belongs to people doing fast calculations. I'll make some calls, she said finally. But Mitchell, you understand what unsealing that record means. It's not just paperwork. There are people at Iron Creek who won't like what they find in it. I know. Voss has been running that base for 4 years. He has relationships. He has Delaney. She kept her voice even. The dog has 56 hours. Make the calls. She hung up and sat with the file for another few minutes, then closed it and went to find the K9 facility manager to arrange after-hours access to Rex's run. The facility manager, a stocky staff sergeant named Trumbull, who seemed to exist in a permanent state of mild exhaustion, looked at her temporary badge and told her that after-hours civilian access required a command authorization signature, and that command authorization signatures went through the colonel's office, and that the colonel's office closed at 1700. It was 1648. She walked to the colonel's office. The aide outside, a young corporal who hadn't yet developed the defensive instincts of someone who'd worked in command administration for more than a year, told her the colonel was in a meeting. I'll wait, she said, and sat down. She waited 31 minutes. At 1719, Voss came out of his office with 2 other officers, mid-conversation, and stopped when he saw her. Miss Mitchell? Not warm, not hostile. Neutral in the specific way that means a decision is being held back. I wasn't aware you had a follow-up request. After-hours access to the K9 facility. I need to continue the evaluation. After-hours civilian access is, I know what it requires. That's why I'm here. Something moved in Voss's expression. The 2 officers with him were watching with the polite attention of people who understood they were witnessing a territorial negotiation. Voss glanced at them briefly, then back at her. 1 hour, he said. Trumbull will supervise. I need 3. 1.5. Trumbull stays in the facility. Agreed. He signed the authorization form his aide produced without looking at it, which told her he was either very confident or very distracted, and she couldn't yet tell which. Then he walked away without further conversation, and the 2 officers followed him, and the corporal handed her the form with an expression suggesting he found all of this mildly exhausting. She took the form and went back to the K9 facility. Trumbull unlocked the east block without conversation, which she appreciated. He was the kind of person who understood that his job right now was presence, not commentary, and he settled himself on a folding chair near the facility entrance with his arms crossed and his eyes half closed and left her to it. Rex heard her coming before she reached his run. She could tell by the change in his body, the way he went from the loose, low posture of an animal in standby to something more alert, more directional. Not aggressive. Oriented. She unlatched the run door and went in. No hesitation, no slow approach. The behavioral frameworks they'd been using on him, cautious entry, neutral body language, de-escalation posture, were frameworks designed for dogs that hadn't been built the way Rex had been built. He didn't need to be de-escalated. He needed to be met. She sat down on the concrete floor. He came to her in about 4 seconds and shoved his nose into her neck, which was not protocol, and she didn't care. She ran both hands through the rough fur behind his ears and felt him exhale, a long, full-body exhalation that seemed to come from somewhere deep and structural, the way an animal breathes out when something it's been carrying finally gets put down. Hey, she said quietly. I know. She stayed with him for the first 40 minutes without attempting any formal evaluation. Just presence. Just contact. She scratched the specific spots on his spine that working dogs always had, the muscle-dense area just forward of the hindquarters where tension accumulated, and felt the rigidity there, the knotted quality of 41 days of stress with nowhere to go. At some point, Trumbull shuffled in the hallway and looked through the run window, and she heard him stop and stand there for a moment before shuffling away again. When she started the formal evaluation, she worked through a command sequence, Not the American English commands in Rex's current file, but the older ones, the European import structure from the program he'd originally trained under. Sitz, Platz, Steh, Voran. Sit, down, stand, go. He responded to every one of them with the precision of a dog who had never forgotten, only been asked to forget. That was the thing nobody had understood about Rex's behavior over the past 18 months. They'd looked at the aggression incidents and the handler conflicts and the failed remediation protocols and diagnosed instability. What they'd actually been looking at was a dog running two incompatible operating systems simultaneously. The deep training of his original program fighting against the surface commands of every new handler who'd tried to override it. The aggression wasn't dysfunction, it was resistance. It was a 7-year-old animal saying, in the only language available to him, "This isn't right. This isn't how I work. This isn't what I was built for." She documented everything in the evaluation forms. Specific, technical, unambiguous. The kind of documentation that was hard to argue with because it didn't ask for agreement. It just described what happened and let the data speak. By the time Trumbull knocked on the facility door and told her time was up, she had 47 pages of handwritten notes and a clearer picture of what the next 50 hours needed to look like. What she didn't have was any indication of what Voss was planning. She found out at 700 the next morning. Pierce found her in the cafeteria before she'd gotten through half her coffee and sat down across from her with the particular energy of someone who'd been awake for a while with information he didn't like. "Voss called a command review," he said, keeping his voice down. 7 this morning, already done. He's bringing in Colonel Marcus Sayers from the Regional K9 Oversight Office to conduct an independent behavioral assessment. She set down her coffee. "When?" "Sayers arrives today at 1400. He wants to run his own evaluation tonight." Pierce paused. His record on non-recoverable designations is about what you'd expect. 14 out of 17 have been upheld. That's not an independent assessment. That's a rubber stamp. "I know that, but Voss has command authority over the timeline, and he's using it." She thought about this. Sayers arriving at 1400 meant evaluation tonight, determination probably by morning, which put her well under the 56-hour window she'd negotiated. She was being compressed on both ends. "Has Delaney's office responded?" she asked. Pierce blinked. "Who's Delaney?" "Nobody." She stood up. "I need to make a call." "Mitchell." He caught her arm, briefly, then let go. "If Sayers makes a non-recoverable determination before your record gets unsealed, Voss has grounds to execute the order regardless of the review timeline. The chain of authority supports him." She knew that. She'd been turning it over since she'd woken up at 0430, lying in the VOQ room they'd assigned her, ceiling gray above her, thinking about the ways this could go wrong. "What's the training schedule today?" she asked. "Standard unit PT until 0900, then operational prep until 1300. "Why?" "I need the evaluation yard. Can you get me 2 hours this morning before Sayers arrives?" Pierce looked at her carefully. "Voss will hear about it." "Good." He held her gaze. She could see him running the same calculations Delaney had run the night before. What this costs, what it means, who ends up holding the consequences if it goes sideways. Pierce was a man who understood institutional risk. He'd been operating inside this institution long enough to know exactly where the load-bearing walls were. "I'll get you the yard," he said. 9:30 to 11:30. "But I'm present for the whole session." "I'd expect nothing less." He nodded once and left. She went to make her call. Chas, Delaney picked up on the first ring, which meant she'd been waiting. "The record request is moving," Delaney said without preamble. "But Mitchell, there's a problem. The classification level on your Kandahar file requires sign-off from 2 separate authorities, one of which is currently traveling internationally. We're looking at 72 hours minimum." "I don't have 72 hours." "I understand that." "Voss is bringing in Sayers, Regional K9 Oversight. If Sayers makes a determination before the record arrives, I know who Sayers is." A pause. "There's another option. We can release a partial summary. Just the service record, not the classified program details. It won't show everything, but it shows your military background. That we can do in 6 hours." She leaned against the wall of the hallway outside the cafeteria. A group of soldiers moved past her, loud with morning energy, not paying her any attention. "Do it," she said. "The classified program details stay sealed for now." "For now," she repeated. "But Delaney, if Sayers runs his assessment tonight and I need to challenge it, I need something in my hand that commands respect at the colonel level. The partial record will show 6 years of service, 2 combat deployments, and a classified program affiliation. It should, she said, but should and does aren't the same thing with men like Voss." Another pause. "I'll push for 6 hours. You'll have it before 1400. She hung up and went back to her room to change into something that wasn't a civilian blazer, because she'd been thinking about presentation since she woke up, and she understood, in the way you understand things you'd rather not, that the next 12 hours were going to require her to be very careful about what she let people underestimate and what she needed them to take seriously. The 0930 session in the evaluation yard was not a quiet thing. Pierce had arranged the yard access, but hadn't done anything to limit who knew about it, either by design or because word moved fast in small military installations and there was no practical way to stop it. By the time she brought Rex out from the East Block at 0940, there were 14 people on the perimeter. Some of them were the same operators who'd been there yesterday. Some were new. A few of them had coffee. She pretended not to notice any of them. The session was a working evaluation. Not a demonstration, not a performance, which meant she was doing what needed to be done, regardless of how it looked to the audience. She ran Rex through the full command sequence she'd established the night before, building from the baseline she'd documented, then introducing task complexity, directional search patterns, scent discrimination, sustained hold positions, target acquisition exercises using a stuffed bite sleeve that Trumbull had located from the equipment room. Rex was not perfect. That was important to understand, and she understood it clearly. He was stressed, under-conditioned from 6 weeks of minimal activity, carrying muscle tension that affected his movement in the pattern work. He broke a downstay twice in the first 40 minutes. On the third scent discrimination run, he pulled left on a vector that should have gone right, corrected himself, then stood at the midpoint of the pattern with his head swinging between 2 options for about 8 seconds before committing. 8 seconds is a long time in a working dog evaluation. She noted it. She noted the correction. She noted the eventual accurate identification. But she also noted what the session showed more broadly. An animal with a trained foundation that was absolutely intact, working through the degradation of 6 bad weeks, responding with increasing precision as the familiar structure came back into him. By the second hour, the break in the downstay had stopped happening. The scent work was clean. Pierce, standing near the secondary gate with his arms not quite crossed anymore, watched all of it. Around 1100, she called Rex off a target exercise and let him take a water break. He was panting hard, the October air cool but the exertion real, and Pierce came to stand beside her. "The Sayers evaluation tonight," he said. "What format is he going to use?" "Standard regional protocol. Probably behavioral observation, handler response testing, threat response assessment." She watched Rex at the water station, his sides working steadily. "Which is wrong for this dog." "Obviously, but you can't tell Sayers his protocol is wrong. He's been doing this for 12 years. "I know." "So what are you going to do?" She looked at Pierce. "Request observer status at the evaluation." He was quiet for a moment. "Voss won't like that." "Voss doesn't like most things I do." "Mitchell." His voice had something in it that wasn't quite caution, wasn't quite warning. More like the tone of someone who has decided to say something honest. "Voss is not just resistant. I've been on this base for 2 years. I've watched him make decisions that don't have clean explanations. The 2 handlers Rex put in the infirmary," she turned to look at him. "The first one, Garza. The incident report says Rex attacked without provocation during a routine leashing procedure. Garza ended up with a broken hand and a laceration. He was medically transferred 2 days later." Pierce paused. "I talked to Garza before he left. He said Rex didn't attack without provocation. He said he'd been ordered to run Rex through a stress exposure drill that wasn't in his training profile, and that when he tried to implement it, Rex reacted. He said Voss personally approved the drill." She was very still. "That's not in the incident report." "No, it's not." "Garza didn't file a complaint?" He was 22 years old and being medically separated with full benefits and a transfer to a comfortable posting in Georgia. Pierce looked at Rex, who had finished drinking and was sitting with his head up, watching them. He wasn't going to file a complaint. She turned this over. Voss ordering stress exposure drills on a dog not profiled for them. 2 handlers in the infirmary. A euthanasia recommendation from a behavioral specialist who, she'd noticed reading the file, had been credentialed through a program that Voss had personally brought to the base. The second handler, she said, Moreau. Same story, different drill, same category. Voss approved it. Moreau got hurt, Rex got flagged as non-recoverable, and the euthanasia order got filed within 72 hours. Pierce's jaw was set. I tried to raise it through informal channels 3 weeks ago. I was told it was outside my scope of authority. She absorbed this. The shape of what was happening here was becoming clearer, and clearer was not always better. Clearer sometimes meant more complicated. Why are you telling me this now? She asked. Pierce was quiet for a moment. Because yesterday morning I thought you were a contractor who was going to get hurt and cause a paperwork problem. He looked at her directly. I was wrong about that. And I figure if someone's going to go after Voss on this, they should know what they're actually walking into. Behind them, the morning was moving, the sun working against the cloud cover with limited success. Somewhere across the base, a vehicle started. Normal sounds, normal day. She thought about the 47 pages of notes in her room and the partial service record that Delaney was going to deliver before 1400, and the man arriving at 1400 with a 14 out of 17 track record for upholding euthanasia designations. Get me that observer status for tonight, she said. Pierce looked at her for a moment longer. Then he nodded and went to make that happen. Sayers arrived at 1348, 12 minutes early, in a vehicle that also contained an aide and a person introduced as his evaluation specialist, a compact, unsmiling woman named Hendrick, who carried her clipboard with the authority of someone who'd been correcting other people's work for a long time. Ava was standing in the K9 facility corridor when they came through, and she saw Sayers register her presence in the way senior officers register the presence of people they weren't expecting in spaces they've already mapped. A brief check, a question forming, then something dismissive sliding over the question and closing it off. He was around 55, silver rank insignia, the kind of bearing that had calcified into posture somewhere around his mid-career and was now just the shape of him. Voss met Sayers in the facility entrance, and they did the back-channel catch-up of 2 men who knew each other. Not warmly, but with the specific ease of people who've attended the same meetings for a long time. Ava watched this from 12 feet away and made certain Voss saw her watching. He acknowledged her with a fractional nod. Ms. Mitchell, you've been granted observer status for this evening's evaluation. Thank you, Colonel. Sayers looked at her then properly. You're the evaluator who filed yesterday's assessment? That's right. I've read your preliminary notes. He said it in a tone that didn't specify what he thought of them. We'll be conducting a fresh evaluation tonight using regional protocol. You're welcome to observe. You're not part of the evaluation team. Understood. He held her gaze for a moment, the particular gaze of a man taking a measurement, and then moved on, pulling Voss into a corridor conversation that moved quickly out of earshot. At 14:02, an email notification hit her phone. She stepped outside to read it. Delaney's office. The partial service record, formatted for command-level review, attached in 2 documents. She read through it in the October cold, standing near the facility entrance with the wind moving steadily. It was enough. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. Her 6 years of service, the 2 deployments, the classified affiliation listed without detail, the evaluations and commendations from a chapter of her career she'd spent 3 years trying to live quietly in the wake of. It was a document that, given to the right person at the right moment, said something she hadn't said aloud at this base yet. She printed 2 copies using the facility's admin printer and folded one into her jacket pocket. The other she left on the desk in the small room they'd given her, with Pierce's name written on the outside of the folder. Pause. The evening evaluation was scheduled for 2000 in the primary training yard, which was lit by 4 overhead banks of work lights that turned everything flat and shadowless. Sayers and Hendrick arrived at 1955. Voss was already there. A half-dozen base personnel stood on the perimeter. fewer than the morning session, but present. Pierce was near the gate when Ava arrived, and he looked at her with an expression that said he'd read the folder she'd left him. He didn't say anything, but his posture had shifted in a way she recognized. The subtle reorientation of someone who's been operating with partial information and has just received the rest of it. She took her position at the observer line and watched. Sayers's protocol was what Pierce had predicted. Behavioral observation first, then a handler response test with one of the base's certified K9 handlers running a standard leash approach, then what Hendrick's clipboard described as threat response assessment, which Ava understood to mean they were going to create an arousal scenario and see what Rex did. The first phase went fine. Rex was brought out by Trumbull, moved to the center of the yard, and observed for 12 minutes while Sayers and Hendrick noted responses to ambient stimuli, the work lights, the perimeter observers, the distant sounds of base activity. Rex was calm, alert, watchful, contained in exactly the way she'd seen him in the run last night. He didn't perform for the observers, he simply existed in the space. Hendrick wrote things on the clipboard. The handler response test was more complicated. The certified handler Sayers had requested, a specialist named Ogundimu, who Ava hadn't met before, approached Rex using the standard American English command structure, and Rex responded to exactly none of it, not from aggression, from incompatibility. He didn't growl, didn't posture, didn't engage. He simply ignored Ogundimu's commands with the complete serenity of a dog who didn't recognize the language being spoken at him. From the observer line, Ava watched Sayers make a note. "He's not responding to handler," Hendrick said. "I see that." Sayers' voice was flat. What Ava wanted to say, and didn't because observer status meant observer status, was that what they were seeing wasn't non-responsiveness. It was program specificity. Rex had been built for a different command architecture, and he was defaulting to it, which was not evidence of behavioral failure. But Hendrick was writing something on the clipboard that almost certainly didn't say program-specific command structure discrepancy, and Sayers was nodding in a way that had already arrived at a conclusion. Then the third phase started. Hendrick produced a long leather sleeve, the kind used for high-intensity bite work, and the specialist who put it on was not Ogundimu. It was a large man Ava didn't recognize who moved into the yard with the sleeve on his left arm and took a position about 40 feet from Rex. She felt Pierce shift beside her. The methodology for a threat response assessment using sleeve work was straightforward in principle. The sleeved specialist moved toward the animal in an escalating approach pattern, measuring arousal threshold and behavioral response. Standard, documented, fine in theory. What happened in the next 90 seconds was not standard. The specialist didn't escalate gradually. He came straight in. Fast approach, hard vocalization, the sleeve arm swinging, at a speed and intensity that was above the standard protocol threshold. Rex's response was immediate and correct. He went to high alert, full arousal, hackles raised, a deep sound coming from his chest. The specialist kept coming. Rex charged. Full engagement, targeting the sleeve, a completely appropriate bite work response to what was being presented to him. The specialist went down to one knee, absorbed the bite. The sleeve took the impact. It was technically a successful bite work response, but the way Sayers was watching and the way Hendrick was writing told Ava exactly how it was going to be characterized in the report. Uncontrolled aggression, threat response exceeding protocol parameters, non-recoverable. She stepped forward off the observer line before she'd consciously decided to. That approach pattern was above assessment parameters, she said clearly. Sayers turned. His expression was not angry. It was somehow more controlled than anger. "Miss Mitchell, you are here as an observer." "I'm aware." The approach pattern used in that assessment exceeded the regional protocol threshold for first contact threat evaluation. The dog's response was appropriate to the stimulus presented. She pulled the folded document from her jacket pocket. "I'd like to submit this for your consideration before you record your determination." Voss took one step forward. "This evaluation does not—" "Colonel," her voice stayed level. "This is a service record summary from a classified program in which I served alongside the K9 unit that trained and deployed Rex. I have documented evidence that his foundational command architecture is intact and functioning. What you observed tonight is not behavioral failure. It was a mismatch between evaluation methodology and the animal's training profile. Silence in the yard. Sayers looked at the document in her hand. He didn't reach for it immediately. He was a careful man, and careful men didn't reach for things without knowing what reaching would mean. The approach velocity in that final phase, Pierce said, from behind her, his voice carrying across the yard, measured, professional, the voice of a man who had decided to step off his own line, was above parameters. I can confirm that from this position. That assessment was not conducted within standard protocol. Sayers looked at Pierce, then at the document in Ava's hand, then at Voss. Voss's expression was the expression of a man watching something he'd arranged very carefully beginning to tilt. Sayers reached out and took the document. He read it in the flat work light, and the yard was quiet enough that Ava could hear the paper between his fingers. She watched his eyes move down the first page. Stop, move back up, reread something. Then he looked at her with the specific quality of attention that belonged to someone who had just found something they weren't expecting in a place they'd been certain was empty. Captain Delaney's office issued this, he said. This afternoon. The classified program affiliation listed here. He stopped, looked at Voss. Something moved between them, fast, wordless, the kind of exchange that happens between people who understand what a particular document means and don't want to say it in front of an audience. Colonel, I'd like to conduct a private review of this evaluation's methodology before I record any determination. Voss was still. His face had gone to a quality she hadn't seen from him before. Not anger, not dismissal. Containment. The expression of a man holding something very tightly so it doesn't show. Of course, he said. Sayers handed the document to Hendrik. Hold the determination. No record submitted until further notice. Hendrik, for the first time, looked uncertain. She took the document. On the perimeter, the base personnel were watching with the focused attention of people who understood that what they were seeing was not normal, even if they couldn't yet say precisely what it was. Rex, in the center of the yard, had settled. He was sitting at the point where the assessment had ended, the sleeve work done, his breathing returning to baseline. His eyes were on Ava. Pierce came to stand beside her and said nothing. Sayers and Voss were moving toward the facility entrance, heads bent, voices low, and Hendrik followed with the clipboard and the folded document that contained 6 years of a life Ava had never planned to explain in a lit training yard in October. That was not, Pierce said quietly, how he expected tonight to go. She watched Voss's back, the set of his shoulders, the thing he was carrying very tightly so it didn't show. No, she said. It wasn't. What she didn't say, because she was already thinking through the next problem, the next compression, the next move in something that had stopped being a dog evaluation and become something considerably more complicated, was that she knew Voss well enough by now, from 48 hours of watching him operate, to know that a man like him didn't absorb a setback and recalibrate. He pressed harder, which meant that whatever he was saying to Sayers in that corridor, in that low, urgent voice with his shoulders set like that, whatever he was arranging right now, tonight, while she stood in a lit yard with the cold coming down and Rex watching her from 15 feet away, it was not a retreat. Her phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize. Not Virginia, a different area code, a different origin, and when she opened the message, there were 6 words and then an attachment that loaded slowly in the base's limited cellular coverage. The 6 words were, "You need to see this now." The attachment was a photograph. It took 11 seconds to load fully, and when it did, she looked at it for a long time. The yard was still around her. Pierce was saying something she wasn't hearing. The photograph showed a document, a command authorization, a signature at the bottom that she recognized, and a date. Not from the past 18 months, not from the handler incidents or the remediation failures or the non-recoverable designation, but from 3 months before Rex had ever been assigned to Iron Creek. Someone had been planning this before the dog even arrived. Pierce was saying her name. She heard it from a distance, the way you hear things when your brain is working too fast on something else to spare attention for sound. She was still looking at the photograph, the document on the screen, the signature at the bottom, the date that preceded Rex's arrival at Iron Creek by 93 days. Mitchell. Pierce's hand on her arm, not grabbing, just contact. What is it? She turned the phone so he could see it. He looked at it for a long moment. She watched his face do the same thing her face had done. The initial reading, the reread, the moment of calculation where the pieces that hadn't fit before started finding their arrangement. "That's a transfer authorization," he said. "Yes." "Voss's signature?" "Yes." "Dated 3 months before Rex was assigned here." He looked up. Rex wasn't transferred to Iron Creek because he needed rehabilitation. "He was transferred here," she said, "because Voss requested him." The work lights were still on over the empty yard. Rex sat in the center of it, watching them with the steady patience of an animal accustomed to waiting for humans to catch up. Across the facility, Voss and Sayers had gone inside. The perimeter personnel had begun to drift, the evening's entertainment apparently over, nobody yet understanding that the evening was not over. She looked at the number that had sent the photograph. Still unrecognized. She typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came in under a minute. "Garza, former handler. Moreau gave me your number. I've been holding this for 3 months, waiting for the right moment. I think this is it." She exhaled slowly. "Garza has documentation," she said to Pierce. "He's been holding it." Pierce's jaw tightened. "He told me he didn't have anything when I—" He stopped, recalibrated. "He didn't know who you were when I asked. He didn't know if I was—" He stopped again. He was protecting himself. "I know." She was already typing. "I need everything you have. Tonight. Already sent. Check your email." She opened her email standing in the cold yard with Rex watching and Pierce looking over her shoulder. 4 attachments. The transfer authorization she'd already seen. A handler incident report, Garza's original, unedited, the version that wasn't in Rex's file, describing in flat procedural language the stress exposure drill Voss had ordered and the specific commands used to escalate Rex past his behavioral threshold. A medical report from the base infirmary that contradicted the official incident log in 2 specific places, and a 4th document that she had to read twice to be certain she was understanding correctly. It was an internal communication. Voss to the base behavioral specialist, the one who'd recommended Rex for euthanasia, dated 11 days before the specialist had begun his formal evaluation. The language was careful, bureaucratic, lawyered in the way of someone who understood institutional paper trails. But the meaning was not ambiguous. Voss had told the specialist what conclusion he needed before the evaluation started. "He orchestrated the whole thing," Pierce said. His voice was controlled, but only just. The handler injuries, the failed remediation, the non-recoverable designation. He built it from the start. "He needed Rex gone," she said. "The question is why?" She looked at the transfer authorization again. Rex had come from a joint special operations support facility in Nevada, a facility with a different command structure, different oversight, a different reporting chain than Iron Creek. A dog with Rex's program history, with his classified deployment record and his intact training architecture, was also an animal with an intact memory. Working dogs didn't testify, but they also didn't forget the environments and people and operational contexts that had built them. She didn't know yet what Rex knew, but Voss apparently couldn't afford the risk. Pierce said, "We need to get this to Sayers before Voss finishes whatever he's telling him in there." "Sayers is Voss's peer," she said. "Going to Sayers with this means Sayers has to decide whether to act on it or protect the institution. That's not a guaranteed outcome." "Then who?" She thought about Delaney, about the 2 authorities required to unseal her full classified record, one of which was currently traveling internationally and therefore unavailable through normal channels. About what normal channels meant in a situation that had stopped being normal roughly 48 hours ago. She typed one more message to Garza. "Is this everything?" His reply. "There's more, but I need to send it through a secure line. I've been in contact with the Inspector General's office for 2 weeks. They're already looking at Iron Creek. They just needed documentation." She read that 3 times. The IG's office. Already looking. She was not the only person who'd been working this problem. She didn't go back inside the facility. She went to the VOQ, sat at the small desk, and spent 40 minutes organizing everything into a coherent sequence. Garza's documents, her own evaluation notes, the partial service record, the photograph, and then she called Delaney and explained what she had. Delaney was quiet for a long time after she finished. "The IG involvement changes the timeline," Delaney said finally. "I know. If they're already building a case, submitting independently could... Delaney. Rex has until 0600. Sayers hasn't formally withdrawn the evaluation. He's only delayed the determination. If Voss gets to Sayers tonight with enough institutional pressure, the determination goes through before the IG has anything actionable. She pressed the heel of her hand against her forehead. I need the full record unsealed. Tonight. Not 72 hours. A long pause. The authority who's traveling, I can reach them through emergency channel. It's a significant ask. I know it's a significant ask. Mitchell, the dog didn't fail, she said. Everything in Rex's file is fabricated to support a conclusion Voss had already written. I have documentation. I have a former handler with direct evidence of command interference. And I have an animal sitting in an isolation run right now that is completely operational and has done nothing. Nothing to justify an execution order except belong to a program that a colonel with something to hide wanted buried. Her voice stayed even. Barely. Make the ask. The line was silent for long enough that she thought the call had dropped. Then, I'll call you back in 20 minutes. She sat in the small room and did not do anything for 20 minutes. This was harder than it sounds. She had learned, in the field, in 2 combat deployments, in the long months of medical work in environments where waiting was the most dangerous thing because it gave your mind space to run all the outcomes, that sometimes the only useful thing was to sit with what you couldn't control and not burn energy pretending otherwise. Rex was 50 yards away in the East Block. Voss was somewhere on this base having a conversation she couldn't hear. Garza was on a phone in whatever city he'd landed in after his medical transfer, having spent 3 months holding evidence he hadn't known how to deploy. And somewhere in an airport or a hotel or a car on a foreign road, a person with the authority to unseal a classified file was either answering Delaney's emergency call or not. She waited. Her phone rang at minute 23. The record is being unsealed, Delaney said. Fee, full access. It'll hit the command system within the hour. I'm also submitting directly to the IG case officer. A pause. Mitchell. What you have from Garza? The internal communication from Voss to the behavioral specialist. That's not a minor infraction. That's command fraud. I know. When this breaks, it breaks fast. You need to be prepared for Voss to move before the documentation is fully processed. She was already standing. How fast? Within the hour, I said. But Voss may have eyes on the command system. If he sees the record access request go through, she was already moving. She found Pierce in the K9 facility corridor and told him in 60 seconds what was coming. He listened without interrupting, which she'd learned was his way. He took information in and processed it internally and came out the other side with decisions already made. The euthanasia order, he said. If Voss wants to move it up, he'd need to override Sayers' hold on the determination. He has command authority to do that. Does he have the personnel? Pierce's expression sharpened. The Trumbull won't. The other facility staff, Ogundimu maybe, 2 or 3 of the junior handlers. He thought for a second. If Voss wants it done tonight instead of 0600, he needs someone willing to carry out the order under a command hold, which gives us a window. A narrow one. He was already moving toward the facility entrance. I'm going to find Trumbull. Pierce. He stopped. Sayers' aide, Hendrick. She has my service record summary. Make sure she knows not to give that document back to Voss. He nodded once and left. She went to Rex. He was awake when she came into the run, sitting against the far wall with his ears up, and she thought about what Pierce had said. The stress exposure drills, the deliberate escalation, the months of systematic mishandling, and felt a specific cold anger that she didn't express because there was no useful outlet for it right now. And she had learned a long time ago that cold anger was only helpful when it could be directed at a solvable problem. She sat down beside him. He pushed his skull against her shoulder. I know, she said again. Her phone buzzed. Not Delaney. The base command system. An automated notification. She opened it and understood immediately what she was looking at. Voss had seen the record access request, and he had just issued a direct command order, timestamp 2241, authorizing immediate implementation of the euthanasia order pending behavioral specialist confirmation. He was bypassing Sayers' hold using his base command authority and citing a safety risk assessment. The timestamp on the order was 11 minutes ago. She was already out of the run, latching it behind her, moving down the corridor. Trumbull was in the facility entrance with Pierce, both of them looking at something on Pierce's phone. They looked up when she came in fast. "He moved the order up," she said. Trumbull's face went through something complicated. I won't be the one to—" "Nobody's asking you to do anything," Pierce said to him, sharp and quick. "Mitchell, the order requires two-person authorization from facility staff. Trumbull's a no. Ogundimu is off base tonight." He was running through the mental list. The remaining certified facility handlers are— A door opened at the end of the corridor. It was Voss. He was alone, which was surprising, and his expression was the expression of a man who had stopped managing appearances because the situation had moved past the point where appearances were the relevant variable. He looked at Ava first, then at Pierce, then at Trumbull. "Staff Sergeant Trumbull," he said, "I need you to prepare the East Block animal for procedure." Trumbull didn't move. "That's an order, Staff Sergeant." "Sir?" Trumbull's voice was careful and strained. "Sergeant Pierce has indicated there's a pending command review that—" "Sergeant Pierce does not have command authority in this facility." Voss's eyes moved to Pierce. "Sergeant, you are 48 hours from your rotation end. I would think carefully about the next thing you say." Pierce looked at Voss steadily. "The IG case officer assigned to Iron Creek is a Major Adrienne Sobol. I believe her office has received several documents in the last hour that relate to K-9 program management at this facility. That's not a threat, sir. That's information." A pause. "I'd think carefully about the next thing you do." The corridor was very quiet. Voss looked at Pierce with an expression that Ava could not fully read, but there was something in it, behind the control, that was the beginning of a man understanding that the ground had shifted further than he'd calculated. He turned to Ava. "You have no authority here," he said. "You're a civilian evaluator with a temporary badge. Whatever you think you've accomplished with your record request and your back-channel communications, Colonel," her voice was very quiet, "I know about the transfer authorization. I know about the communication to your behavioral specialist. And in approximately 30 minutes, the IG case officer assigned to this base is going to know everything I know." She held his gaze. "The question you should be asking yourself right now is not how to stop that. It's whether carrying out this order tonight is the thing you want added to the documentation when the full review begins." Voss's jaw was set. His hands were at his sides. The thing about men like Voss, she had learned, not from this base, not from him specifically, but from years of working in environments where men with authority and something to hide made decisions in corridors like this one, was that they had two modes when the wall appeared in front of them. Some of them stopped. Some of them accelerated. From somewhere outside, a vehicle pulled up to the facility entrance. Headlights swept through the narrow window above the door. Then another vehicle. Then a third. Pierce looked at the window, then at her. She had not called anyone to come to this facility tonight. Delaney was in Virginia. Garza was wherever he was. She had sent documents to the IG case officer's office through Delaney's channel, and she had expected that to move through the slow machinery of institutional process. She had not expected vehicles at 22:52 on a Tuesday night. The facility entrance door opened. The woman who came through it was in uniform, mid-40s, and she carried herself with the specific efficiency of someone who had been awake for a long time and intended to remain so. Her name tape read Sobol. Behind her, 2 additional personnel. Behind them, a silence that pressed against the walls of the corridor. Major Adrienne Sobol looked at Voss, then at Ava, then back at Voss. And when she looked at Voss, her expression was the expression of someone who has reviewed a substantial amount of documentation and arrived at a facility with a specific purpose. "Colonel Voss," she said, "I'm going to need you to step away from the K-9 facility." Voss did not move immediately. For a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3, he stood in that corridor with everything he'd built at Iron Creek arranged behind him and the wall fully visible in front of him, and Ava watched him decide. He stepped back. Sobol turned to Ava. "Ms. Mitchell," she said, "I've read your evaluation documentation and the materials submitted through Captain Delaney's office." A pause, precise and deliberate. "I have some questions. But first, is the animal secure?" "Yes," Ava said. "Good." Sobol glanced at the corridor behind her, at the 2 personnel who'd come in with her, and something passed between them, that was operational and quiet. Then she looked back at Ava. I also received a full unsealed service record from a classified program, cross-referenced with the K9 transfer documentation and the internal communication between Colonel Voss and the base behavioral specialist. She paused again. The euthanasia order is suspended pending full IG review, where relief was not the right word for what Ava felt. It was more complicated than relief, more physical. The particular sensation of something that has been held very tightly, finally being allowed to unclench. She nodded once. Sobol turned to her two personnel and said something in a low voice, and they moved toward Voss with the unhurried certainty of people who understood exactly what their job was right now. And Voss, who had commanded this base for 4 years, who had built a case file on a dog to conceal something he couldn't afford to have found, who had ordered stress drills and written conclusions before evaluations and signed transfer authorizations 3 months before an animal arrived. Voss stood in the corridor and watched his authority walk out the door in front of him. One of Sobol's personnel said, "Sir, we'd like you to come with us." Voss said nothing. He went. Sobol turned back to Ava. "I said I have questions." Her voice was not warm exactly, but it was direct in a way that Ava found she could work with. "Starting with your full classified program history and its relationship to this animal." She glanced toward the East Block. "But there's something I need you to see first, something that came in with the documentation that I don't fully understand." She held out a tablet. On it was a document Ava hadn't seen before. A file from the Nevada facility, Rex's origin base, marked with a classification level that made the partial service record she'd sent Sayers look like a library card. It was Rex's full program history, not just his deployment record, his origin record. And in the program designation at the top, the classified program he'd been built under, the one that had sent him to Kandahar, the one that had put him in the same operational theater as Ava Mitchell in 2018, there was a case number she recognized, because it was also in her own classified file. Not as a supporting program, not as an adjacent operation, as the same program. She looked up at Sobol. "Ms. Mitchell," Sobol said carefully, "how well did you actually know this dog?" The question hung in the corridor like something physical. Ava looked at the tablet, at the case number, at the program designation that connected Rex's origin record to her own classified file, not as parallel programs, not as overlapping operations, but as the same single program with the same single funding source and the same single command authorization chain. She had believed for 6 years that her role in Kandahar had been medical support attached to a K9 unit. Adjacent, contributory, not central. The case number said otherwise. "How well did you know this dog?" Sobol repeated, and the question was not rhetorical. She was watching Ava with the focused patience of someone whose job required reading the difference between a person thinking and a person deciding whether to speak. "I need to see the full origin record," Ava said. Sobol took the tablet back and pulled up a second document, swiped it across, handed it back. Page 3, the handler assignment matrix. Ava found page 3. The handler assignment matrix was a table, program designation, deployment phase, assigned handler, secondary personnel, medical support. She ran her eyes down the columns. Her name appeared 4 times, not as medical support, as secondary handler, cross-trained, evaluated for primary program continuation. She had spent 8 months in Kandahar, believing she was there to treat handlers and assist with dog care in a supporting capacity. The program records described a different role, one she had been placed in deliberately, trained into incrementally, evaluated against criteria she hadn't known she was being evaluated against. She had been building a relationship with Rex for 8 months in 2018 and 2019 without understanding that the relationship was the point. "They were building a backup handler profile," she said. "That's how we read it," Sobol said. "If your primary handler went down, injury, KIA, incapacitation, the program needed someone who could maintain operational continuity with the animal, someone Rex already knew, someone he'd accept commands from in a high-stress environment." She paused. "You were that person. You just weren't told." The corridor was quiet, except for the building's ventilation system and the distant sound of base activity filtering through the walls. Pierce was standing 6 feet away, and she could feel him processing this the same way she was. The slow, restructuring quality of understanding something that changes the shape of what came before it. Voss knew, she said. It wasn't a question. That's what we need to establish formally. But the transfer authorization, the one dated 3 months before Rex arrived here, was filed with a specific program notation that references your civilian employment record at Hargrove Regional in Kellerton. Sobel's voice was precise. Voss knew where you were and what you were doing before Rex ever left Nevada. The termination letter on her kitchen counter, the budget restructuring, the departmental consolidation. He had me removed from my position, Ava said. Possibly. That's also under review. Sobel took the tablet back and tucked it under her arm. Ms. Mitchell. Right now, Colonel Voss is being detained for preliminary questioning. That process will take several hours. What I need from you tonight is a full debrief on your Kandahar service beginning from the program origin and including every interaction you can document with this animal. She glanced toward the East Block. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to need you to demonstrate what you've established with Rex in a formal evaluation setting. A real one, with IG observers present. Because the euthanasia order is suspended, but it isn't closed, and the base legal office is going to require a documented behavioral determination from a qualified evaluator before I can shut it down permanently. What time tomorrow? 0800. 7.5 hours. Agreed. Get some sleep, Sobel said, with the tone of someone who understands the advice is probably going to be ignored. My team has the facility. She didn't sleep. She spent 2 hours in the debrief room with Sobel and one of Sobel's personnel, a quiet, precise captain named Wexler, who took notes with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had done this many times, going through everything she remembered from Kandahar. The chronology, the handler relationships, the specific sessions with Rex and the other program animals, the evaluations she hadn't known were evaluations. She talked until her throat was dry, and the institutional coffee in the paper cup in front of her had gone completely cold. Sobel asked careful questions. She didn't push, didn't lead, just opened spaces and let Ava fill them. Wexler wrote without expression. At 1:30, she was released and went to her VOQ room and lay down without changing clothes, and stared at the ceiling doing what she'd told herself not to do. Running the outcomes, mapping the variables, trying to find the version of tomorrow morning where something else went wrong. The problem with intelligence and operational experience was that it made you very good at imagining failure. She knew exactly how many things could still go sideways before 800. Voss had allies on this base who hadn't been detained. The base legal office was an institutional entity with its own momentum and its own interests. Sayers hadn't formally withdrawn his evaluation, only delayed it, and Sayers answered to a regional command structure that Sobel's authority might not fully reach. And Rex. Rex was 7 years old, physically stressed from 6 weeks of confinement, carrying the neurological weight of 41 days in isolation. She had seen his recovery over the past 2 days, seen the precision coming back into him, seen the trained architecture resurface. But what she was going to need to demonstrate at 800 wasn't just behavioral stability. She was going to need to show an IG observer and a base legal representative that this animal was not only non-dangerous but operationally functional. The standard of evidence required to permanently close a euthanasia order at a military installation was considerably higher than the standard required to open one. She knew that. She lay with it on the ceiling above her until around 300, when her body apparently decided she'd spent enough time being useful and went to sleep without her permission. Bad. Pierce knocked on her door at 06:30. She was already dressed. She opened the door and he was standing in the hallway with 2 cups of coffee from the cafeteria, one of which he handed her without a word, which was exactly the right instinct. Sobel's team has been in the command building since 0400, he said, following her into the room. Voss was questioned until 0230 and then transferred to a holding facility off base. His aide was interviewed. The behavioral specialist, the one who filed the non-recoverable determination, was reached by phone at 0500 and is currently cooperating. She drank the coffee. It was bad, but it was hot. Sayers? Still on base. He and Sobel had a meeting at 0600 that I was not invited to. He came out of it looking... Pierce searched for the word. Rearranged. Good rearranged or bad? Unclear. He sat down on the edge of the desk. There's something else. The base legal office submitted a motion to the IG review this morning, requesting that the behavioral determination be postponed pending a full command review. They're arguing that any evaluation conducted during an active IG investigation lacks procedural integrity. She lowered the coffee cup. If the motion is granted, Pierce said, the euthanasia order stays active during the postponement. She saw exactly what that meant. And during a command review, who holds euthanasia authority? Regional command, above Voss's level. Who appointed the regional command? Pierce's expression said she'd arrived at the right question. Voss was on the selection committee. She set the cup down, picked up her jacket. Where's Sobel? Sobel was in the conference room in the K9 Facility Administrative Building, working through something on her laptop with Wexler across from her, and a phone on the table that was on a call it was putting on hold every few minutes to take another call. The kind of morning that happened when an investigation that had been building for weeks suddenly broke open all at once. She looked up when Ava came in. The legal motion, Ava said. I'm aware of it. If it's granted, I know what happens if it's granted. Sobel's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that was not quite patience. I'm working on it. With respect, Major. She stopped, recalibrated. What do you need from me? Sobel looked at her for a moment. Then she gestured at the chair across from her. Sit down. Ava sat. The legal motion has a procedural window of 4 hours. It was submitted at 06:15. The regional command duty officer has until 10:15 to grant or deny it. Sobel closed the laptop. If the motion is denied, we proceed with the 0800 evaluation as planned. If it's granted, the evaluation is postponed and the euthanasia order stays active under regional authority, which, she paused, has complications. What's the basis for denial? That the evaluation is not a function of command authority. It's a function of the evaluator's credentials and the animal's documented behavioral history. The IG investigation is reviewing command conduct, not evaluation methodology. They're separate processes. Sobel leaned forward slightly. The argument holds, but the duty officer this morning is a lieutenant colonel named Harwick, who served under Voss at his previous posting. The shape of it was very clear. So it's not a legal question, Ava said. It's a relationship question. For the next 4 hours, yes. Wexler's phone buzzed. He looked at it, then at Sobel. Garza's on. Sobel took the phone, listened for 30 seconds, said, understood, and sent it directly to Wexler, and hung up. She looked at Ava. Garza has one more document. He held it back because he wanted to verify its chain of custody before submitting it to the IG. What is it? A direct communication between Voss and Harwick, dated 6 weeks ago, discussing the wreck situation. Sobel's expression was controlled, but something in it had sharpened considerably. Discussing what to do if an evaluator challenged the euthanasia order. Ava was very still. Harwick isn't a neutral party, she said. Harwick is potentially a co-conspirator. Sobel was already reaching for her own phone, which means the legal motion submitted this morning isn't a procedural check. It's a move. Can you get the duty officer replaced before 10:15? I can escalate, whether escalation moves fast enough. She was dialing. Go run your evaluation, Ms. Mitchell. I'll handle this. The 0800 session in the main evaluation yard was watched by 11 people, which was fewer than the previous sessions but more consequential in terms of who they were. Sobel's 2 personnel were at the perimeter. Wexler had a camera. Sayers was present, standing slightly apart, in the same configuration as the previous evening, but with a different quality of attention. The base legal representative was a stiff captain named Pruitt, who stood with his arms crossed and his face arranged into the expression of someone there to find fault. Pierce was at the gate. He'd been there when she arrived with Rex, and he'd looked at the assembled observers and then at her and said, "Ready?" in the tone of someone who already knows the answer but asks anyway. "No," she said honestly. "Yeah," he said. "Me neither." He opened the gate. The first 30 minutes were documentation work. She ran Rex through the full command sequence with Wexler filming, working from the baseline she'd established over the previous 2 days, building through the complexity levels. Rex was not at his best. He was tired. She could feel it in his response, a half-beat of delay between command and execution that hadn't been there yesterday afternoon. He broke a pattern search on the second run and had to be reset, which she did without comment, simply repositioning him and restarting the sequence from the prior checkpoint the way you reset a process that has encountered an error. Not a failure, a recovery. Pruitt made a note. She ignored it. At 0847, she moved into the task evaluation phase. This was the part that mattered. Not the command responses, which any working dog with Rex's training could produce on a good day, but the operational task work that demonstrated functional integration of training, instinct, and handler relationship. She set up a modified search scenario using equipment from the training compound: 3 target locations, varied concealment, directional guidance rather than direct command, the kind of work that required Rex to make independent decisions within a trained framework. He was slower than she wanted. On the first target, he overshot the scent cone by 8 feet before correcting, and she felt the watching eyes in the perimeter track that mistake, with the attention of people cataloging evidence. She gave him nothing, no correction, no reassurance, no signal that the mistake was anything other than a data point in a process. She waited. Rex worked back through the pattern, hit the scent cone again, and drove it to source with the precision of an animal whose nose had never forgotten what his legs were temporarily confused about. First target. He sat and vocalized. The trained indication behavior, sharp and clear. She moved him to the second. It went cleaner. The third was the best of the 3. He hit the pattern right, drove the cone, indicated inside 90 seconds. When she released him from the final position, he shook himself once, all over, and pressed his side against her left leg. She looked up. Sayers was watching the dog. Not the clipboard, not the camera. Rex. She hadn't planned what came next. It wasn't in the evaluation format, wasn't something Sobel had asked for. But she'd been thinking about it since the debrief, since the handler assignment matrix on page 3, since understanding what her 8 months in Kandahar had actually built. She said quietly, "Rex, Voron." Forward. He moved out ahead of her, loose and directed, into the open center of the yard. She gave him a hand signal, right, and he went right, left, and he went left. Stop, and he stopped, turning his head back to her, checking. Find. It wasn't a real search. There was nothing to find. But the behavior it produced was the behavior she needed the 11 people on that perimeter to see. Rex quartering the open yard with systematic purpose, looping back to check her position, adjusting his pattern based on her presence and the environmental information available to him. Working. Not performing. Working, the way an animal works when it understands what its job is and has a handler it trusts. And the long, damaged weeks of isolation have been replaced by something that makes sense again. Pruitt had stopped writing. When she called Rex back to heel and turned to face the perimeter, Sayers spoke before anyone else could. "Sergeant Pierce," he said, "was your earlier assessment of the approach velocity during last night's threat response assessment an official objection?" Pierce was quiet for a moment. "Yes, sir. It was." Sayers nodded, slowly. He looked at Pruitt. The assessment methodology in last night's evaluation fell outside regional protocol parameters. That's documented by Sergeant Pierce's objection and confirmed by review of the camera footage from the session. He paused. The behavioral determination from that evaluation cannot be recorded. Pruitt's jaw shifted. "Colonel Sayers, the base legal motion has been denied." Sobel's voice came from the facility entrance. She walked into the yard with her phone in her hand and her expression carrying the specific quality of someone who has been on the phone for 3 hours and has achieved what they needed to achieve. Lieutenant Colonel Harwick recused himself from the duty officer role at 0923 due to a conflict of interest identified in documentation submitted to the IG office this morning. The motion was reviewed by the alternate duty officer and denied at 0941. She looked at Pruitt directly. The evaluation proceeds. Pruitt said nothing. Ava said nothing. Rex sat at her left knee and watched the yard. The formal determination took 40 minutes to document and another 2 hours to process through the base legal system, which moved at its own pace regardless of what had happened in the yard and didn't particularly care that 3 people were waiting in a small administrative room, refreshing their phones. Pierce brought more bad coffee. Ava drank it without tasting it. At 12:23, Wexler came out of the command building and walked across the compound to where they were sitting on a low concrete barrier in the thin October sun. He handed Sobel a folder. She opened it and read the first page and handed it to Ava. The euthanasia order had been permanently closed. Rex was cleared. The language in the determination was bureaucratic and dry, and she read it 3 times anyway, each time catching a different phrase that meant the same thing. Not a threat, handler compatible, operationally functional, cleared for reassignment pending program review. She got to the end of the second page and just stopped, holding the paper, and something went through her that she didn't have a clean word for. Not relief exactly, because relief implied the fear had been simple, and this hadn't been simple, but something in the same family, something that lived in the chest. Pierce, sitting beside her, looked at the folder. "Is that it?" "That's it." He nodded, looked at the compound around them. "You know," he said, "when you walked into that yard 2 days ago and I told you to stay behind the secondary line, I remember. I was certain you were going to get hurt, and I was going to spend a week doing incident reports. I know. I was wrong." He said it simply, without the performance he'd been running when they first met, without anything underneath it except the directness of someone stating a fact they've verified. "About that and about a few other things." She looked at him, his profile against the flat October sky, the quality of honesty in his face. "You went out on the line last night," she said, "when Voss made the threat about your rotation." "Yeah. That was a real risk for you." "I know what it was." She held that. "Thank you." He didn't say you're welcome. He just nodded once, and they sat with the folder between them and the October sun, doing what it could against the wind. Wob. The investigation's full scope became visible over the following days in the way investigations always did. Not dramatically, not in a single revelation, but in the layered way of something that had been built quietly over time, now coming apart in reverse order. Voss was formally charged on day 3. Conduct unbecoming, abuse of command authority, falsification of official records, and conspiracy to obstruct an IG investigation. The charges were filed at the regional level with IG documentation attached. Garza's materials, the internal communication to the behavioral specialist, the transfer authorization, the Harwick correspondence. It was a file that had taken multiple people months to build and 4 days to deploy, and when it landed with the particular completeness of something that had been assembled carefully. Harwick was placed under investigation separately. The process around him was slower. He'd been more careful than Voss, his communications less explicit, but Garza's documentation had established the connection, and the IG was patient. The behavioral specialist, a civilian contractor named Pollard, who had spent 3 years on base and built a comfortable working relationship with Voss, submitted a statement of cooperation to the IG office on day 2. The statement described in careful and increasingly specific language what Voss had told him, what the expected determination had been, and the ways in which Pollard had understood his continued contract to depend on delivering it. He was not charged. He lost his contract. He lost his base access credentials. His professional certifications were referred to the relevant oversight board for review. He left Iron Creek on a Wednesday with a single box of personal items, and the expression of a man who understood that cooperation had bought him his freedom, but not his reputation. Ava watched none of this directly. She was in the K9 facility, working with Rex. Sobel had authorized extended access. The investigation needed her present for ongoing documentation review, and Rex's reassignment process required handler continuity during the transition. She got up at 600 every morning and spent 2 hours in the East Block before the administrative day started. She ran the evaluation exercises, rebuilt the conditioning that 6 weeks of isolation had degraded, worked on the specific neurological reset that working dogs needed after extended stress, slow reintroduction of complex tasks, handler-led pattern work, steady, reliable daily structure that the animal could use as an anchor. He got better day by day in the specific, uneven way that recovery actually worked. Good days, and then a bad one. A session that felt like breakthrough followed by one that felt like regression, and she documented all of it honestly because the documentation was supposed to capture the truth, not a polished version of it. Pierce came by the facility most mornings. Not always with coffee, not always with information. Sometimes he just leaned against the fence near the East Block run and watched her work and didn't say anything, and she found she didn't mind. On day 5, Sayers formally withdrew his regional behavioral assessment from the record. His written withdrawal was 2 pages long and included an acknowledgement that the evaluation methodology used in his team's session had not been appropriate for the animal's training profile, and a statement that his preliminary findings should be considered void. It was the document of a man who had arrived on base expecting to validate a predetermined conclusion and had found himself, instead, in the middle of something that required him to reconsider how he'd been used. It was not an apology, but it was something. On day 6, the operators who had been in the yard on Ava's first morning, the ones who had stood at the perimeter with their arms crossed and their expectations settled, and their over-under running on how fast she'd be asking to leave, started coming by the K9 facility. Not all at once. In ones and twos, in the loose, slightly awkward way of people who need to say something but haven't quite worked out what it is. A specialist named Rourke, who'd been loudest at the perimeter that first morning, showed up on day 6 with a question about Rex's scent discrimination training that was technically legitimate but was clearly also an excuse to be in the facility. She answered the question without noting the excuse. He stayed for 40 minutes and watched Rex work and left without saying much else. But he came back the next day with a better question, and the day after that he asked if he could run the start of the morning session himself, under her direction. She said yes. He fumbled the first command sequence. Wrong intonation. The German inflection was harder than it looked, and Rex sat at the midpoint of the pattern and looked at him with the patient skepticism of an animal who has been training with professionals for 7 years and can tell the difference between someone who knows what they're doing and someone who is trying. Again, Ava said, slower on the second syllable. Rourke tried it slower. Rex moved. Rourke looked down at the dog with the expression of someone who has just understood, in a small way, what it had taken Ava 2 days to demonstrate in a large one. Huh, he said. Yeah, she said. It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't a scene of formal recognition or collective reckoning. It was a specialist learning to pronounce a German command correctly while a Belgian Malinois waited with measured tolerance. But it was real, which mattered more than anything orchestrated would have. On day 8, Sobel called her into the conference room for what she described as a follow-up debrief, and turned out to be considerably more than that. Wexler was there. A civilian at the far end of the table who hadn't been at any previous meetings. A man in his 50s in a suit that was too good for a military facility, which meant he'd come from somewhere else, which meant this conversation was happening at a level above what she'd been dealing with so far. Sobel said, "This is Mr. Aldridge. He's a program director from the office that originally administered the Kandahar classified program." She paused. "He has some things to tell you, and then he has a proposal." Aldridge didn't do preamble. He opened a folder and pushed it across the table. "What you've been told about your role in the Kandahar program was incomplete, not inaccurate, incomplete. Your designation as secondary handler was always intended as a temporary classification pending a primary handler determination. That determination was interrupted when the program was administratively closed following operational changes in theater." She looked at the folder, at the designation page, at the words temporary and primary handler determination and the date attached to them, which was 3 months before she'd left Kandahar. They'd been about to tell her, she thought. 3 months before she'd come home, they'd been about to change her classification, and then the program closed, and she'd come home as a medical specialist and spent 6 years thinking her time there was a chapter she'd closed. "Rex was the only surviving program animal," Aldridge continued. "When he was transferred to the regular military working dog program, his classified training record was suppressed to protect program security. The handlers who received him were working with an animal whose full capabilities they weren't cleared to know about." He folded his hands. Voss had access to the program records as part of a different classified oversight role. He understood what Rex was and what he represented from a documentation standpoint. He was concerned about exposure. "Exposure of what?" she asked. Aldridge was quiet for a moment. The program had certain operational elements that weren't fully documented through standard channels. Voss's name appears in some of those elements. not in a capacity that justified concealment to the degree he pursued, but he wasn't rational about it. Men like Voss rarely are, once they decide their career is at stake. She thought about Rex in the isolation run. 41 days. The stress drills, the deliberate handler cycling, the conclusion written before the evaluation. All of it to eliminate an animal who, at the end of it, had simply been waiting for someone who spoke his language. The proposal, she said. Aldridge turned to Sobel. The program is being re-examined for limited reactivation, Sobel said, specifically the handler-animal integration component. Rex is a documented, functional program-trained animal. There's an interest in using him as the basis for a new evaluation structure. Handler compatibility training, program methodology development. She held Ava's gaze. The position would require someone with your specific background, medical training, K9 program experience, and existing handler compatibility with the animal. Ava looked at the folder, at Rex's case number and her own in the same document, at 7 years of a dog's life that had been built, disrupted, nearly ended, and was now sitting 50 yards away in an East Block run waiting for the next session. I'd be based here? She asked. You'd be based wherever the program determines, Aldridge said. Initially, yes. Iron Creek, during Rex's transition period. She thought about the termination letter on her kitchen counter in Kellerton, the lease that had expired, the 3 things that had arrived on the same morning before she'd finished her coffee. I need to know one thing, she said. The re-examination of the program, is Rex's operational future contingent on the program being approved, or is the euthanasia order permanently closed regardless? Sobel didn't hesitate. Permanently closed regardless. Rex is cleared for service. The program approval is separate. Ava nodded. Then I need 24 hours, she said. Aldridge looked faintly surprised. He'd expected an immediate answer. She could see that. A woman who'd spent 8 days fighting for a dog offered the position that made sense of everything, and he'd expected yes before she finished hearing the offer. 24 hours, she repeated, to think clearly about a decision I'm going to have to live with for a long time. That's not hesitation. That's how I make decisions. Aldridge looked at Sobel. Sobel looked at Ava with something that might have been approval. 24 hours, Sobel said. She spent that evening in the East Block with Rex, not working, just sitting in the run with her back against the fence and the dog pressed against her side. And she thought about what Aldridge had said about the Kandahar program, and what Delaney had said about unsealing her record, and what Pierce had said about being wrong, and what none of it quite covered. The 6 years between leaving Kandahar and standing in this yard, the apartment in Kellerton, the job at Hargrove Regional, the quiet life she'd built out of ordinary materials in the wake of something she'd never quite been able to name. She'd been good at the nursing. She wanted to be clear about that, even just to herself. She'd been a good nurse and she'd found real work in it, and the people she'd cared for had not been abstractions to her. But there had always been something, not a gap exactly, more like a frequency she could hear that most rooms weren't tuned to. She'd thought that was just the residue of service. The thing you brought back and learned to carry quietly. Rex shifted beside her, put his chin on her knee. She looked down at him. He looked back with the direct, uncomplicated attention of an animal that had made its decision about her several days ago and saw no reason to revisit it. She thought, 7 years old is not old for a Malinois. With correct handling, good conditioning, meaningful task work, 8 more years, maybe 9. She thought, the program will require travel, instability, work environments that are not predictable or safe or quiet. She thought about what Sobel hadn't said in that conference room, which was the thing Ava had been holding since she read the full program documentation on day 3. Voss's interference hadn't just been about concealing his own name in the program records. The stress drills, the deliberate handler cycling, the manufactured case for euthanasia. The level of effort involved was disproportionate to simple self-protection. There was something else in those program records, something Aldridge had called operational elements not fully documented through standard channels and closed before she could ask the next question. She needed to know what it was before she signed onto a program built from its foundation. She took out her phone and typed a message to Delaney. Full program documentation, not the summary, everything. By morning. She waited. Delaney's reply took 4 minutes. That requires Aldridge's sign-off. She typed, "Then get it." Another pause. Longer this time. Then, "Check your email in 10 minutes." She looked at Rex. He was watching the run entrance with the habitual alertness of a dog whose job had always been to notice things before the humans around him did. His ears moved, just slightly, orienting towards something she couldn't hear yet, something from the direction of the facility's administrative wing, something that had his attention in the specific way that wasn't threat response and wasn't handler orientation, but was the third mode, the one she'd learned to read over these 8 days. The mode that meant something is changing. Her email notification came through at the same moment that the lights in the East Block corridor changed. A brief flicker, power fluctuation, the kind that happened on old military bases when something large drew from the grid unexpectedly. She opened the email. The full program documentation loaded in sections, page by page, and she read forward from where Aldridge had stopped, past the handler assignment matrix, past the operational deployment records, into the section marked Program Purpose and Scope. She read 3 paragraphs and stopped. Read them again. The program hadn't been built around dogs. The dogs were the mechanism. The operational purpose, the reason the program had been classified above standard working dog programs, the reason Voss had spent months systematically eliminating a single animal, the reason her own record had been suppressed, and her civilian employment had been quietly terminated, and her name had appeared on a list that was supposed to have only one name on it, was something she had spent 8 months adjacent to in Kandahar without ever understanding what she was adjacent to. Rex shifted against her. The corridor light stabilized. From the administrative wing, she heard a door. Footsteps. 2 sets, moving in the direction of the East Block. She looked down at the program documentation on her phone, at the 3 paragraphs, at the thing they described that Aldridge hadn't told her in the conference room. The footsteps stopped outside the East Block entrance. A knock. Not urgent, not aggressive. Official. The sound of someone who has been sent. "Ms. Mitchell?" Not Sobel's voice. Not Pierce's. A voice she didn't recognize. "Mr. Aldridge would like to continue your conversation." She looked at Rex. He was looking at the door. She stood up. Rex stood with her, automatic, his shoulder against her left leg, and she put one hand briefly on his head, not to steady him, to steady herself, and then walked to the East Block door and opened it. 2 people in the corridor. One she didn't recognize, a young officer in utilities who had the look of someone executing an errand. The other was Aldridge, still in his good suit, still with the folder, and he had the expression of a man who had made a calculation and was no longer certain it had been the right one. "You read the full documentation," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Then you understand why I didn't lead with it this afternoon." She looked at him steadily. "I understand that you made a decision about what I could handle and when, which is exactly what every person in a room with authority has done to me since I walked onto this base 9 days ago." Aldridge absorbed that. "May I come in?" She stepped back. He came into the East Block corridor, and the young officer stayed outside and the door closed behind them, and Rex watched Aldridge with the attentive neutrality he gave to people who hadn't yet been categorized. "The program's operational purpose," Aldridge said, "was handler animal compatibility research for long-duration classified operations. The specific application involved medical intelligence support," she said, "using the handler's medical training to assess personnel in operational environments. Human targets. I was being evaluated as an intelligence asset, not just a handler backup." Aldridge was quiet. "The dogs were the cover," she said. "A medical specialist working with military animals has access and mobility that a designated intelligence operative doesn't. Lower profile. More flexibility. And if the program was ever exposed, the K9 component was the story, not the intelligence collection." She looked at him. "That's what's in the program purpose section. That's what Voss was protecting. Not just his name in the records, the existence of the methodology." "He was protecting his authorization of the methodology," Aldridge said carefully. "His signature is on the original program approval. If the program was examined during an IG review of his conduct, certain questions would arise about how that methodology was sanctioned and what oversight existed. And the answer is that the oversight was insufficient. Yes." She let that sit for a moment. Rex had settled against the wall, watching both of them, running his particular version of the calculation she was running. "The proposal you made this afternoon," she said. "The re-examination of the program, the handler-animal integration component, that's not the whole proposal. You're not re-examining the K9 methodology. You're re-examining the intelligence application." Aldridge opened the folder and placed a single page on the concrete ledge beside the run door. "The full proposal. What I wasn't cleared to present this afternoon without program directorate sign-off." She looked at the page, read it in the corridor's flat overhead light. The position wasn't a training role. It wasn't handler development or program methodology or anything she'd been told in the conference room. It was an operational position, specifically a program lead role for a restructured version of the Kandahar methodology, with full transparency about its intelligence application, proper oversight architecture, and a mandate that included building the handler training framework from a starting point of informed consent rather than incremental discovery. The thing she'd been recruited into without her knowledge 7 years ago. Being offered now, honestly, with the full picture on the table. She set the page down. "Why me?" she said. "Specifically, there are people with deeper intelligence backgrounds. None with Rex." Aldridge's answer was immediate and unambiguous, which told her it was the true one. The program's foundation is the handler-animal pair. Rex's training architecture is intact and documented, and he has an established compatibility relationship with you that took 8 months to build originally and has been demonstrated under field conditions over the past 9 days. Finding another handler would take 18 months minimum, and Rex is 7 years old. He paused. "The program needs you, and it needs you to understand what you're entering. Which is why you're here tonight." "Yes." She looked at Rex. He was watching her now, not Aldridge. His ears were slightly forward, his posture carrying the quality she'd come to recognize as his attentive mode. Not working, not resting, but present in the specific way of an animal waiting to understand what direction things were going. She picked up the page and read it a second time. The oversight architecture was real. She could see the signatures, the review structure, the reporting chain. Someone had built this carefully after learning what the absence of structure had produced. It wasn't perfect. No design system was. But it was honest about what it was and what it required, which was more than the original program had been. "I want 2 conditions," she said. Aldridge waited. "Rex's welfare is non-negotiable. If his physical or behavioral condition requires operational pause, that call is mine. Not directorate, not program review. Mine." "Agreed. And every handler I train under this program knows from day one what they're being trained for. Full disclosure, informed entry. No one builds a life inside a program they weren't told they were entering." Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. "That's a significant departure from the original methodology." "The original methodology put a classified program in a position where a colonel could use it to try to kill a dog," she said. "I'd call that a design failure." He closed the folder. "Agreed." She held his gaze. "Then yes," she said, "I'll take the position." The formal proceedings against Voss were public in the way that institutional accountability is public. Not dramatic, not cinematic, not with the neat arc of a story, where the villain faces his accusers in a room that holds all the people he wronged. It happened in offices and review boards and legal proceedings that Ava attended some of and received documentation of the rest, and the outcomes came down in writing rather than in speeches. Voss was formally charged on day 11. The charges were read into the record at a regional command review attended by base personnel, IG officers, and legal representatives, and the specific language of each charge: conduct unbecoming, abuse of command authority, falsification of official records, conspiracy to obstruct an IG investigation, was a list that took 4 minutes to read aloud, which was longer than most people expected. He sat through the reading with the stillness of a man who had decided at some point in the preceding days that dignity was the only thing remaining that he could control. His face gave nothing. But she'd seen his face in the corridor of the K9 facility when Sobol had arrived, when the ground shifted, and she knew what was underneath the stillness. Harek's investigation moved more slowly, but arrived at the same place. He was relieved of his duty officer role pending a full IG review of his involvement in the suppression of Garza's evidence, and the communication between him and Voss that Garza had held for 3 months became the central document in a separate misconduct case that would take months to fully adjudicate, but had, from the moment it was submitted, only one plausible destination. Pollard, the behavioral specialist, lost his certification. The Oversight Board reviewed the case and suspended his credentials for professional misconduct. Specifically, the production of a professional assessment designed to reach a predetermined conclusion on behalf of a commanding officer. He could apply for reinstatement in 3 years, under conditions that were, the board's language made clear, unlikely to be easily met. Garza, when Ava finally spoke to him by phone on day 12, a long call, winding and honest and occasionally halting in the way of two people navigating something neither of them had a script for, said he'd spent 3 months wondering whether holding the documentation had been cowardice or strategy. Both, probably, she said. Yeah. A pause. Probably. Another pause. Is he okay, Rex? He's better than okay, she said. He's working. She could hear Garza's exhale through the phone. Good, he said, and she could hear everything that word was carrying, all the months of it, the weight of what he'd witnessed and held and finally put down. You did the right thing, she said. It mattered. Eventually, he said. That's usually how it works. The commendation ceremony was Pierce's idea, technically, though he would deny it if asked directly, and she had never fully verified the attribution. What she knew was that Sobel told her on day 14 that a formal recognition was being arranged at the command level, and that when she said she'd prefer to skip it, Pierce appeared in the K9 facility doorway that afternoon and told her, in the plainest possible terms, that skipping it was not an option. It's not for you, he said. It's for every person on this base who watched what happened and needs to see the ending. She thought about that. That's manipulative. Yes, he agreed. Are you coming? She came. The ceremony was held in the main briefing room set. Not a parade ground, not a formal assembly, just the largest indoor space on base filled with personnel in a way that made it feel more significant than its walls. Sobel spoke briefly. Sayers, who had remained on base through the investigation at Sobel's request and would leave the following morning, stood in the back of the room with an expression that she could read across the distance as something between discomfort and respect. The operators she'd seen at the perimeter on her first morning were there. Rourke in the front row, 3 others clustered near him, all of them with the particular posture of people who have revised a significant opinion and are still adjusting to the revision. The commendation language was formal and somewhat dry, the way official recognition usually was: exceptional service, distinguished evaluation conduct, demonstrated professional expertise, significant contribution to the integrity of the base K9 program. She stood in front of it and accepted it and managed to look like someone who was comfortable being in front of a room, which she mostly wasn't. Then Sobel stepped back and Pierce stepped forward, and he was not reading from a paper, which meant what he said next was his. 9 days ago, he said, I told this woman to stay behind the secondary line. He looked at her directly. She walked across it, and everything that followed, the investigation, the evidence, the documented truth about what was happening on this base, all of it follows from that moment. From one person deciding that the line drawn for her by people who'd already made up their minds about who she was and what she could do was not the right line. He paused. I was wrong about her. I want the record to show that, and I want her to know I said it in front of everyone. The room was quiet. I was wrong too, Rourke said from the front row. Not standing, not formal, just saying it. The way you say something when you've practiced it and then abandoned the practiced version for the true one. 2 other operators nodded. Nobody made a speech of it. It wasn't the kind of room for speeches. She looked at Pierce. She looked at Rourke. She looked at the room and the people in it. Not perfect people, not reformed people in the clean way of stories where recognition transforms everyone it touches. Just people who had seen something they couldn't unsee and were standing in front of it. Thank you, she said. That was all. Rex was outside the briefing room because there were reasonable limits to what a formal military ceremony could accommodate. And when she came out, he was sitting beside Trumbull with his ears up and his attention locked on the door. And when she came through it, he was on his feet before she reached him. She crouched down and put both hands on his face, and he pressed his forehead against hers, which was not a trained behavior and was not in any program documentation and was simply what he did. and she stayed there for a moment with the October air moving around them and the sounds of the bass going on steadily in every direction. She left Iron Creek on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after she'd arrived with a temporary badge and a termination letter in her recent memory and a phone call from a 703 area code that had changed the direction of everything. She wasn't leaving for good. The program position required a month of administrative processing, clearance updates, and program integration before she'd be formally assigned. She'd be back. Rex was staying, properly housed now, properly staffed, with Rourke assigned as primary day handler under a supervision structure that Pierce had helped design and that used the European command architecture she'd established. She'd be back in 4 weeks, and Rex would be here, and the work would continue. But this version of it, the 9-day version, the urgent version, the version where she'd arrived knowing nothing about what she was walking into and had walked across a secondary line and kept walking, that version was ending. Pierce walked her to the visitor processing center. They didn't talk much on the way. There wasn't a lot left to say that hadn't already been said in better moments than a parking lot on a Thursday morning, and they both seemed to know that. At the processing center door, he stopped. "Kellerton," he said, "you had an apartment there. Lease expired. So I'll figure it out." She picked up her bag. "I usually do." He looked at her for a moment, not the assessing look of the first morning. Something different, something that had had 9 days to develop into a more accurate read. "Yeah," he said, "I noticed." She went through processing, got her temporary badge logged out, and drove out through the gate onto the access road that cut through the tree line and emerged at the highway with Redstone Harbor gray and wide in the distance. She drove for a while without the radio. She thought about Kandahar and the 8 months she'd spent there building something she hadn't been told she was building. She thought about whether to be angry about that. She'd spent some time over the past week being angry about it. The quiet, precise anger of someone who has discovered that a chapter of their life was not what they understood it to be while they were living it. And she didn't think the anger was wrong, exactly. It was appropriate. It was the response of a person who deserved to know their own history. But she'd also spent 9 days watching what happened when the suppressed thing surfaced. What Rex had done in that yard. Not performing, not demonstrating, just working, just being exactly what he'd been built to be. Refusing to stop being that even after 41 days of someone trying to erase it was not a small thing. You could put things in isolation. You could cycle handlers and run incompatible drills and build a case file designed to conclude before it started. You could do all of that, and the thing that was true would keep being true underneath it. It would wait. It would cost you time and energy and the accumulated weight of not being seen correctly, but it would wait because it didn't have anywhere else to go. She had been a nurse in Kellerton for 3 years, and before that, a different kind of nurse in a different kind of place. And she had been built by experiences that nobody at Hargrove Regional had known about, and that had been fine, mostly. She wasn't certain she'd trade the quiet years. She'd done real work there and meant it. But she was also not uncertain, sitting on the highway with Redstone Harbor behind her, that crossing that secondary line had been the right decision. Not because it had worked out, though it had, in the grinding, incomplete, never quite as clean as the resolution deserves way of real things working out, but because the line had been drawn by people who had already decided who she was, and no line drawn by people who've already decided should be the thing that determines how far you go. That was the lesson, if there was one. Not that quiet strength always wins, because it didn't always, and she'd been in enough environments to know that the system didn't always correct itself, and documentation didn't always surface, and the right people didn't always arrive at the door at 22:52 on a Tuesday night. But that the alternative, staying behind the line, allowing the assumption of who you were to be the outer boundary of what you did, was not something she could recommend from personal experience. She was 31 years old, and she'd spent 6 years living below the actual level of what she knew how to do, and she was not going to do that anymore. She merged onto the interstate and pulled up Delaney's number on the car's display and called it. Delaney answered on the second ring. "You're on the road?" "Just left." "Administrative processing starts the 16th. I'll send you the location." "I know." A pause. "Delaney, the original program, the 8 months I spent not knowing what I was doing, was there anyone in that structure who wanted to tell me?" A pause on the other end. Honest pause. not evasive. Yes. What stopped them? Protocol, Delaney said. And the program was closed before the process completed. By the time there was authority to disclose, there was no active program to disclose about. She absorbed that. It was not a satisfying answer, but it was, she thought, a true one. The new program, she said. Full disclosure, informed entry. You have that in writing. I have it in writing. Good. She watched the highway ahead of her, the distance opening up. Then I'll see you on the 16th. She hung up and drove. 3 weeks later, she pulled back through the Iron Creek gate with a permanent badge and a program assignment document and a duffel bag that contained less than the minimum recommended for an open-ended posting, because she'd always traveled light and saw no reason to change that now. Rourke met her at the K-9 facility. He looked different than the man who'd stood at the perimeter fence with his arms crossed on her first morning. Not transformed, not remade, just adjusted, calibrated to something more accurate. He knew, Rourke said, jerking his head toward the east block. Before you even drove through the gate, he's been up since 600. She didn't say anything. She just went to the east block and opened the run door, and Rex came to her in 3 steps and shoved his skull against her palm the same way he had on her first day. And she put her hand on the back of his neck and felt the difference. The muscle tone that had come back, the tension that had left, the animal that had been waiting patiently and without alternatives for the world to make sense again. Okay, she said quietly, let's go to work. It wasn't a perfect ending. It never is. Voss's legal proceedings would take months. Harwick's case would drag longer. The program Aldridge had proposed would hit obstacles she hadn't anticipated and require compromises she hadn't planned for, and there would be days, probably, when she would wonder what the version of her life looked like that had stayed behind the secondary line. But Rex was standing in the October morning, and his ears were up and his eyes were on her, and the training yard was open ahead of them. And Ava Mitchell, who had been dismissed and reduced and quietly removed from every room where decisions were made, who had been handed a termination letter and a phone call on the same morning and had driven to a military base with a temporary badge and nothing guaranteed, she walked out into that yard and started the session from the beginning, the way you always had to, because the work was never finished and the truth of what you were didn't announce itself. It just kept showing up. That was enough.